Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are well. I hope that you have been, first of all, learning Torah on days that aren't just Fridays, but especially today. What an honor it is to be with you, wherever you are. And I see we're in all sorts of different settings, that Torah can live through this technology. Where we are is an enormous gift that scientists and technologies and coders knew that they were doing, but didn't know how holy they were helping our lives be. So let's be proud of their work and glad that we got to show up. I love starting Torah learning with a blessing for learning. Some of you might have heard this melody. It was written by Rabbi David Paskin, a very sweet colleague in Florida. If you know it, sing along. And you're on mute, so sing loud. Okay, here we go. It ends with the words la'asok b'divrei Torah, to be busy with words of Torah. All right, let's get right to it. In a second, friends, I'm going to share my screen and you'll see from Sefaria.org, which I'm imagining you've experienced, you've explored. I hope that you have. It is a wonderful way of making Torah and so much commentary, contemporary and ancient, accessible. It's available to everybody for free because of the work of amazing, Jews who know their stuff and philanthropists who have supported that work. It's such a powerful thing to see the access that all of us have by choice into Torah. It means that rabbis like me can't say, well, I've got the book on my shelf, so I know more. The truth is, that's just temporary. We can catch up with each other, and I can really, really dig deep with this, just like you. I hope that you'll take advantage. There's also a really wonderful app. They just changed the user interface to make it even easier, so don't miss the chance to dig deep. I'll be sharing the screen, but you'll have the screen even when I'm done sharing it. That's one of the gifts. This week, we're reading Parashat Ki Teitzei. It's the middle of the Book of Deuteronomy. On the Jewish calendar, as you probably know, we're racing towards Rosh Hashanah. Anyone involved in getting services led or davening or reading Torah or helping organize community recognize that this is the home stretch. And hearing that urgency as we are going through Moshe's urgency, because Moses has been saying goodbye. Moses has been saying goodbye now for half a book. For someone who, when first called by God to free the people, said, Arel tzvatayim anochi, I'm a person who doesn't speak well. He seems to have really learned. He's one of the master orators of all time. And here we are hearing him give us a litany, not just of the narrative, retelling the story of everywhere that we've been. We also have the rules for building a just society. In fact, this week's Torah portion, Ki Teitzei, has more rules than any other Torah portion, 72 by the count of Rambam, by the count of Maimonides. I want to look at really just the beginning of the Parsha, but given that there's so much in it, I'm going to have to leave stuff out. Let me tell you some of what we're not going to look at, and then we'll look directly in. The end of this week's Torah portion is the command to remember what Amalek did to us as we left Egypt. The end of this week's Torah portion, we read right before Purim. We think about often, Amalek was an enemy that ambushed us where we were most vulnerable, in the back. The people who move slower. The Torah indicates that that's women and children, but you and I know that plenty of men move pretty slow, and sometimes our bodies are designed differently, and sometimes that affects how quickly we get through the world physically. Well, that's something important to think about. The most vulnerable parts of Israelite community were the ones that Amalek attacked, and that's what made Amalek the worst enemy, when you hurt someone where they're most vulnerable. Which means if we want to be the opposite of Amalek, which is part of what we learned this Parsha, we have to be there as support, especially where we all are vulnerable, because no one isn't. The only reason those people are in the back of the line is because we are facing that way. If we turned around, they'd be in the front. All of us take turns being vulnerable, and that means it's an obligation in this Parsha to not be like Amalek, to be the ones who would show up in support of our most vulnerable. Another section of the Torah we're not going to look at is one of the most mysterious small mitzvot, which actually is not very small. You might have heard this one. I hope you have. If you come across a nest, and in the nest are eggs, and the mother bird is hovering over the nest, it's a mitzvah to shoo away the mother bird before collecting the eggs. In Hebrew, we call that shiloach haken, sending the mother bird away from the nest. And in fact, it's one of two commandments in the Torah where the reward is promised immediately, and it's the reward of a long life. The other one, right, I'm offering, this is one of my favorite things to do, I'm offering 2,000 rabbi points, which are only good for trading and for more rabbi points. But I'm offering 2,000 rabbi points to you if you can name the other mitzvah for which you are promised a long life. Julie, you can't do this. You've written Torahs, you know this. Okay, so I need Carrie, right? There you go. All right, there's a lot on my screen, but I see Carrie was excited to know it. So is Miss Bimia. Oh, here's Raymond. Seems like we all know our Torah. Awesome. The two mitzvot for which we are promised a long life, if we fulfill them, are sending the mother bird away and honoring your parents. There are famous stories, including a novelization of an ancient rabbinic text. The book is called As a Driven Leaf. You can learn a lot about a very painful story. And I don't want to get too far into it, except to link it to what I've already said, and to use both of those as a framework for looking at the verses we're about to see. Remember, Amalek hit us where we were most vulnerable. The story of a character whose name was Elisha ben Abuya, an ancient sage, who knew Torah. And the Torah promises, if you send the mother bird away, you'll live a long life. If you honor your parents, you'll live a long life. And he went and saw a father tell his son to go send the mother bird away and then collect the eggs. Both mitzvot for which you're promised a long life in the same act. The son listens, goes and climbs a ladder to send the mother bird away, gathers the eggs, and while walking down the ladder, trips, falls, and dies. It's a terrible story, and you might not have tuned in today to hear it. But I want to use it as a really important framing of what we do when the world is unfair and how we counter that. How we counter that. So speaking of making the world more fair, I'm going to beg your indulgence literally for 10 seconds. My son just locked himself out of our home. So I'm going to go on mute off camera for 10 seconds, count it, and I'm going to let him back in. Excuse me 1 second. Was it 10 seconds? Okay. Look, if you teach Torah and you're telling a story about taking care of parents and taking care of children, you better go take care of your child and not let them stand outside. Thank you for understanding, everyone. All right, where were we? Oh, right, Torah. Now, I'm about to share the screen. But remember the framework. Caring for each other where we are most vulnerable, because we do take turns being vulnerable, sometimes locking ourselves out. And also realizing that the Torah may make these promises, but that doesn't suddenly make the world a fair place. You've probably been paying attention to some pretty drastic headlines this week, and I won't lose our conversation by politicizing it. But the application of this week's Parsha is striking, and that's why I'm choosing the verses we're going to look at. And I'll just ask you to hold in your heart really vulnerable people all around the world, local and beyond. And remembering that the world sometimes is simply just not fair. What's our obligation in those moments? First of all, to keep our hands on our hearts so that we can face a world that isn't fair and still have courage and hope. And we're supposed to act. So let's think about all of those things, friends. Here's the Parsha itself. Here we go. So I'm hopeful that you can see my screen. Gonna keep the text as large as possible. I'm looking for a thumbs up or two to make sure you can see it. Thanks, Julie. Okay. You might know these verses, but I want us to think about all the things I've already said. I'm not going to repeat it again. And let's look. Ki Teitzei lemilchama. We should hear it, right? Even these hard verses are meant to be sung. And I can't do it any other nusach, any other melody than the one that I learned as a child. So I imagine different communities have a different feel as they sing it. But here we go. I'm going to highlight like this. Ki Teitzei lemilchama al oivecha untano Adonai Elohecha biadecha v'shavita shivyo. And the reason why I emphasize the melody that I'm using is that sounded kind of pretty. Torah sounds pretty, always. We always sing it. But look at these words. Really, look at them. We sing these words. When you take the field against your enemies, which is not a great translation. I love Sepharia, but sometimes the translation isn't great. Look at the Hebrew here. I'm highlighting on the left. Ki teitzei lemilchama. When you go to war. That's a little bit more blunt and a lot harder to hear that when you take the field against your enemies. When you go to war and God delivers them into your power and you take some of them captive. I'm asking us to hear these words and not contextualize them and not simply accept them. You know, Judaism is not about hearing something and accepting it immediately, even from the most sacred of sources, our Torah. We are called to be incredibly mindful about the impact of Torah if applied literally, in this case, God forbid, but the ethical dimension of going to war. What a thing for us to be thinking about this week. So let's keep looking, and I'm going to make a few arguments that come from traditional sources, but I'm not asking you to abdicate the responsibility for thinking this stuff through yourself. We are called to really grapple. This week's Parsha is not a simple one, not the parts I named before, and not what we're looking at now. When you go to war and God delivers them into your power, think about what that means in any of our hearts. My sister is a chaplain in the US Navy. The intersection of religion and warfare, it's very complicated. And you take some of them captive. Now that's already generic enough within the horror of war, but look what continues. I don't want to skip these verses, even though I wish they weren't there. And you see among the captives a beautiful woman, in Hebrew, an Eshet Yifat Toar, and you desire her. So by the way, who's the you in the ancient world? The Torah is not speaking in an egalitarian way to men and women. It's speaking to men who are soldiers, who conquer, and who see in the conquered property, which is how we must read these verses. Reject them, though we must as well, in the way that they see human beings. You see a beautiful woman and you desire her and would take her to wife. Now, I took the text back just for a second to look you in the eyes. We are human beings, and on the screen, we are of all genders, or many. What is this saying? When you conquer, God will deliver it into your hands, and the objects, include human beings. Now, I'm going to make an argument that is really It's nuanced. So I want to say it and then look for it, okay? I'm not trying to make you see it the way that I do, though I believe this is a good way to do it. But I don't want to miss the chance to say this. Those verses are so hard to read with modern eyes, especially with modern eyes that are trying. I'm a white, straight man trying to be sensitive to what it is to hear these verses. If I weren't those three things in a social world that gives me privilege I did nothing to earn, but what if I were a woman? I don't know how I would read that. I don't know. What if I had, God forbid, been a prisoner of war and read this? So when it says, you see a beautiful woman and you want her, the Torah could have gone in just as difficult a direction and said, take her. God gave her to you. I mean, by the way, as I'm saying this, yuck a million times. Yuck. That's not my God. That's not what I think human beings should do. It's not how people should be treated, objectified. But the Torah could, given its contemporary world, continued and said, you see her, you want her, you take her. God gave her to you. Which, by the way, sounds like Agamemnon or sections of the Battle of Troy, the Iliad. The ancient world is full of this yuck. I want us to notice that the Torah doesn't go in that direction. It doesn't make it suddenly okay. But look at how the Torah continues. I'm going to give us the verses back. And I know, by the way, I know we've been doing this for a long time. If we were sitting in the same space and all of us had the text open, we would, some of us would be pounding the table, shock in our eyes. Some of us would race to defend the text, I'm sure. That's fair. And some of us would say, I can't study this. This can't be Torah. And we'd all be right. Torah is bigger than one of our approaches. But I think that neutrality in the face of such terrible, harsh language, neutrality isn't an option. So I long for the moment. And my Jewish learning, I got to tell you, I said my Jewish learning, I just objectified my friend Julie. Julie, you are bringing together community in such a way that we can see our facial reactions when we look at this part of the Torah. Thank you for that. And for everyone who, I'm not judging anyone who's off camera. For everyone who's present with your faces, please know that without your faces, the Torah doesn't mean as much. It is our investment, our response, that gives the Torah its infinite meaning. So here comes the Torah's continuation of what was already difficult. And one day, please God, may we struggle in person together, not only offering the visual of our faces, but our whole selves. Here we go. Back to the text. I'm just going to read the first verses again. When you take the field, right, when you go to war, and God delivers your enemies into your power, and you take some of them captive, and you see among the captives an Eshet Yefato, or a beautiful woman, and you desire her and would take her to wife. This is where the Torah actually goes. You shall bring her into your house. El toch betecha. Bring her home. And she shall trim her hair, which is not a great translation here. V'gilcha et rosha means shave her head. Right? So this is interesting. Again, not okay, but interesting. V'asta et tziporneha, and trim her nails. Now, think about this. I'm going to go back to the text in 3 seconds. I know I'm going back and forth. I hope it's not making you dizzy. How does this woman feel? The Torah is not saying this woman must feel dehumanized, subjugated, defeated, scared, abandoned, mourning. But the Torah does say those things if you look for it. The Torah says to this victorious soldier, and I got to tell you, the person, for all the horror of war, must be surging with power. We won, we won. And now he's bringing her into his home and shaving her head and trimming her nails. And I want to talk about her as a full person, but what I also want to do is talk about how this man is experiencing this moment, as if I can know either one of those things. I can't, but I'm going to stretch for a moment. He saw her and thought she was beautiful, and the first thing he has to do is bring her into his home and shave her head and trim her nails two external signs in the ancient world of beauty. Suddenly she doesn't look like she looked. And he's told in this moment of, I don't know how to say this, but like hyper masculinized, adrenaline pumping moment of rage and probably lust or whatever. And the first thing he has to do is stop. And the object that he wants suddenly doesn't look the same way that it did before. It is such an important moment that the Torah says, even imperfectly in modern eyes, but for the ancient world to be subjected to this pause in a moment of bloodlust and war and victory, that's something that we shouldn't miss. The Torah is, and I'm making my larger point now, and we'll go back to the text like I promised. The Torah is often a response to the world as it inherits it. The Torah responds to the way the world was by pushing it forward and making it one step better, which means that if we're to be Torah true, we have to be part of that trajectory. It's not that the Torah got us here and that's where we stay. The Torah modeled for us what it is to see the world as unfair, like we spoke about before, and full of vulnerability, like we spoke about before. And our job, like the Torah, is to move it forward in time, make it one step better than the world that we inherited. I want to show you a textual way that we do that and then continue where we are. I'm putting the text back on the screen. There's one word here that I want to point to. See this word that I highlighted on the left? Ki. Now the translation that we have offered here is when. One of the big gifts, by the way, of Sefaria, it's a sort of recent addition to the wealth of stuff that appears on your screen when you highlight a word. On the right side of your screen, you probably see this amazing dictionary that instantly appears. I haven't analyzed it, but so far I've been really thrilled by it. Now, Ki Teitzei la milchama can translate as when you go to war, but ki doesn't always mean when, and doesn't always mean because. Ki also often in the Torah means if. What if with sensitive ears and pretty universally wounded hearts? Because who doesn't feel like that recently? Ki teitzei la milchama, if you go to war. Isn't that a really important difference? War is not inevitable. It's a choice. If you go to war, this stuff can happen. So look where the text continues. All right, so I said, this soldier, after victory, is called to bring the Eshet Yafat Toar, the beautiful woman, into his home, where her hair is shaved off. She trims her nails. She discards her captive garb. Even what she's wearing changes. And she didn't dress like a captive. This is what she was wearing when she was captured. What he saw her in when he wanted her. She shall spend a month's time in your house. Lamenting is not a good enough word, even though it's a really important word. Grieving her father and mother. What does that sound like? What is not only her grief, which doesn't get enough airtime in the text, but what is her grief experienced by her captor, who is commanded to give her the space and time to grieve? She goes through shloshim. She suddenly is a person grieving, not suddenly. She never stopped being a person, even in the Torah's complicated glimpse here. Only after that, this is how I would have translated that. The word only is missing here. Only after that, you may come to her and possess her. And again, I'm not apologizing for the Torah's language here. I'm pointing to it with deep discomfort. Also, now, there's so much to say. I won't say all of it. I'm just going to say there's so much about this that needs to be said in our world today. I'm sure we all can think of places where this language feels frighteningly modern. But after that, you may come to her and possess her, and she shall be your wife. I want to say this sequence one more time. I know I just did. The victorious army includes this man who sees a beautiful woman and wants her. The Torah says immediately, you have to take her home. And shaving is sometimes in the ancient world a sign of grief. Not shaving is also, ironically, a sign of grief. She goes through that, trimming her nails, and she has to be able to grieve her parents for 30 days, for a month, in your home. I guarantee you, that's not a silent experience. It's a very present experience. And this soldier, during those 30 days, probably cools down from the heat of battle. This is, though imperfect, a humanizing of the woman. And importantly, and I speak to my sister, I told you, who's a chaplain in the US Navy today. Recovering the humanity of people who are trained to fight is very hard. Some of you might be veterans, some of you might be maybe your family in the service. Recovering humanity, maintaining it, discovering it, tending to it. There's something happening in the text here, which while I feel myself deeply distressed by this parsha, I also find pockets, really small pockets, of implied humanizing. They don't go as far as I want them to go, but the world, I'm saying this with tears in my eyes, the world doesn't always go as far as I want it to go when it comes to humanizing others. There but for the grace of God go I. I'm okay today, and I didn't earn that. I'm working hard for my family, but the fact that they're okay is not something that I have full control over. There but for the grace of God go I. And recovering our humanity and holding on to it is something that these verses provoke, which is why I would sing these verses even while they hurt. These questions, I see them coming in, friends, and I won't have time to address all of them, but I want to say, Joel, you just asked, what rights does the woman have when it comes to marriage? Not enough is the answer. Not enough. But she is not treated in the way that the ancient world did treat human beings when they were conquered by other armies. Is that sufficient for our modern ethical sensibility? Of course not. But she has more rights than she would have had elsewhere, and not enough to be seen as a full human, right? We have work to do, and the Torah has always demanded that we do it. 2 parshiot ago, when we read Shoftim, it said, when you have a big question that you can't answer, ask your judges in your day and do what they say. Pretty sure that my judges think differently than the Torah does. And yes, Lior, as you said, and this is where my heart is mostly, it is heartbreaking that we still have war, but that means that we have to do this thinking if we are to end war, and where there is war, if we can remain human. So, looking a little bit further. Richard asked a question that I just can't answer. In the world to come, will there be male and female? Since Judaism basically believes that no one's come back to tell us, and that's one of the defining characteristics of Judaism, I don't know. But I will say this. I hope that in the world to come, being male and being female matters less than it does in this world. Because what is implied by those terms is usually some place in society. We should remain interested in each other. That's great. But we shouldn't see those terms as being as defining as they are when it comes to dignity. The world to come should have dignity unquestionably for all. Okay. Let's go back to the Parsha. You have it on your screen, yeah? Okay. We have a couple minutes left, and I know this will be a ragged conversation that goes deep very quickly and doesn't tie itself in a bow when we're done. But I hope that it'll be comforting and inspiring and maybe even provocative so that we can be agents of doing more good in the world because of what we've learned. I keep on wanting to apologize for every verse. I'll hold off now so we can just get to it. But you should know that, like, a real student of Torah feels this stuff, right? We all feel this stuff. I can't read this and stay calm or feel good. I can feel committed and passionate. So that's what we'll bring. Then, after this month of grief that she has gone through, and after you, the victor, have the right to have her, I want to say be with her, but that's too gentle, to have her, If you should no longer want her, you must release her outright. Now, release her outright, again, is not a great translation. Look at the Hebrew here. V'shilachta lenafsha. First of all, even the use of the possessive at the very end of nafsha, I'm showing you right here. The hey with the dagesh in it, the hey with the dot. V'shilachta lenafsha, she owns her own soul. Send her to herself. Now, that doesn't mean abandon her, because in the world of ancient Israel, every resident, citizen and not, was supposed to be treated fairly, had shelter, and manna fell from heaven so they'd have enough to eat. Our notion of poverty and abandoning, clearly women were more vulnerable in ancient Israelite society than men, but no one was truly bereft in the way that we think today. So if he doesn't want her because something changed, the word here is chefetz, which means desire and object. If he doesn't want her anymore, the way that he did with the bloodlust of war, he sends her to herself, and look what it says. You must not sell her for money, meaning you don't own her. I know the language is gross, but you don't own her, the Torah says to this man. Since you had your will of her, meaning you could have had her, you did what you needed to do in order to have the right to be with her, you must not enslave her. But the Hebrew here for enslave her is also not a great translation. Inita, like the phrase of ona'at dvarim, you can't hurt her. She's not indebted to you. She's not yours. You had a chance. And you did it the way we told you to, and you came to your senses and made a decision, and she doesn't belong to you once you've decided. It's a humanizing again. So a little bit more of the Parsha. It doesn't get better, but it doesn't get worse. It stays at this level. And the commentary that I want to channel is Sforno, and there are other translations who do this. It continues and says in verse 15, Ki tiena le'ish shtei nashim, if a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the unloved one. I told you it doesn't get better. You might remember the stories of Leah and Rachel in the book of Genesis, the book of Breshit, where in order to compete for their husband's love, who was going to have more children? And again, the ancient world is full of this. I'm not defending it, nor am I comfortable, obviously, with the idea of having two wives. But Sforno makes this a causational linkage. Remember, we just read about the woman who is beautiful and taken captive. Sforno says, if you do that, this is going to happen. You will end up loving someone more, loving someone less. And if the firstborn of the one you loved less is yours, you owe that person, and this is called primogeniture, where the oldest son inherits everything. But what a terrible situation. And it continues. I'm going to move very quickly forward, because the very next section of the text is one of, if that wasn't all bad enough, we've got 9 minutes, let's go further. What happens next? You go to war and all of that stuff happens, and then you have two wives and one and the children, and then the text says, verse 18, you know this, I'm assuming it's one of the most famous sections of the text. I'll read the Hebrew and then go to the English. I don't want to sing this one. As a parent, I can't sing this one. Ki el ish ben sorer umoreh, einenu shomea b'kol aviv uv'kol imo, v'yisru oto v'lo yishma aleihem. In the English, if a man, and I'll use the gender translation here, you'll see why in a second. If a man has a wayward and defiant son who does not heed his father or mother and does not obey them even after they discipline him, I'll read the whole section. I've interrupted each verse so far. Let's do some in sequence. After they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his town at the public place of his community. They shall say to the elders of the town, this son of ours is disloyal and defiant. He does not heed us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Thereupon the men of the town, the men of his town shall stone him to death. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. All Israel will hear and be afraid. All right, so here's a question, show of hands. Who likes the Parsha now more since we've looked at it? So glad nobody's hands are raised. I want to share with you what I said before, meaning the general approach that I have to learning Torah, is that the Torah is a response to the world as it was. That world, says the Torah, is not good enough. It's got to be better. We have to build a more just society. We have to love our neighbor. We have to do that. Here's how we're going to do that. And even though the Torah doesn't say that explicitly, so many of the rules of the Torah are reactions to the surrounding societies. If you ever study a comparison, one of the most explicit moments, I don't want to get lost in this, but it's a useful illustration, is the story of the flood of Noach, where, of course, the flood destroys the world. It's not the God that I want to believe in and daven to, but there's a parallel version of that story in ancient Near Eastern literature called the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the gods destroy the world not because we were sinful. That's the Torah's notion of it. Gods destroy the world because people are making too much noise and the gods can't sleep. Think about the revolution that Torah represents in that comparison. The gods in the story of Gilgamesh are upset because we inconvenience them, because we're too noisy. But our God, the God of the Torah, which maybe is another face for the divine as it evolves in the world, our God is upset when we hurt each other. Not because we're noisy, but because we hurt each other. That God is different. That God wants us to be good to each other, and that's the way that we learn that. So too in our section. So when we look at this section of the rebellious child, and with this we're going to close in just a minute, hold on to that lens for seeing Torah. Because what the rabbis do in the ancient world is pretty immediate. I want to share the screen and show you verse by verse in really short fashion what the tradition does to this section of the text. If a man has a wayward and defiant son, the rabbis want to make this impossible. The rabbis say in the end of their debate, Lo haya v'lo nivra, there never has been and never will be such a child as this, which means we will never ever do this. How do they make it so that we'll never do this? They make it impossible to qualify someone as the ben sorer umoreh, the rebellious child. How do they do that? By taking these verses more literally than anything else in the Torah. So, if a man has a wayward and defiant son, that tells you that the father has to still be living. So if a child is rebellious and the father has died, they can't be considered this rebellious child. More, a wayward and defiant son, not a daughter. So this wayward and defiant child is only potentially half of our children, and only if their father is still alive. Let's keep going. Who does not heed his father or mother, which means both have to have warned him. So if this son was only warned by one parent, they're not this rebellious child, and this story never happens. His father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the town. This, the rabbis understand, and this is where it begins to be ridiculous, but in the best of ways. The rabbis then say, neither one of the parents can have a limp, because they have to bring him at the same pace. They both have to be able to hold him with their hands, which means their limbs need to function, which means if any one of them has any physical limitation, this child is not that child, and therefore this never happens. It goes further. See where it says here, their accusation in front of the elders of the town? He is a glutton and a drunkard. Zolel v'soveh, in the Hebrew on the left I'm highlighting. And the rabbis say he has to have stolen this much alcohol and this much meat, and if he hasn't done these excessive things, he's still not the ben sorer umoreh, which means the story never happened. The rabbis are twisting every verse as much as they can so that they can say no to the Torah, just like the Torah said no to the world that it inherits. The rabbis, using strange traditional mechanisms, are saying, this is not good enough, and we've learned from the Torah to push the world one step towards being better. What an amazing statement being made by the rabbis in response to the tradition. And remember that if we take these stories sequentially, the way many traditional Torah scholars have, then we say, look at what happens when you go to war. Look at what happens when I think I have more God than you. Look at what happens when I weaponize my lust. And step after step, both within the Torah and in the tradition of the Torah, we respond as a Jewish tradition that has an evolving notion of what it is to be good. We make steps so that we can be better. Every opportunity we have, sometimes by looking at the Torah and saying, no, you taught me no. I'm not rejecting you, Torah. I'm teaching you, Torah. I want you to remember my tradition, what you've taught me. We can always do better. We can always be better. Will my great-great-grandchildren, please God, I have some, look back and say, I did enough? Probably not. Because there will always be a better we can be. But I do hope that they look back and they're proud of me for trying my best to move this world, as I hope all of our descendants, all of our students, all of future generations will look back at this strange moment of our history and say, I'm so proud of them. They found each other and they learned together and they strove to be better, and they weren't satisfied with the world as it was. Because God forbid, when this pandemic truly comes to, I don't know, a close, but becomes a safer thing to navigate as a world, going back to normal will not be good enough. Now we remember what it is to be vulnerable. Then I hope we'll really remember, so that anyone who remains vulnerable will have increased care from all of us, So friends, I know it was heavy. I know it was a lot, but that's the Torah. Sometimes it is simply sweet, and sometimes it's not so simple. So I hope that we'll take this time this week and really dig deep in ourselves, in relationship with Torah, so that we can really help the world just a bit more, just the way the Torah helped the world a bit more too. We can be part of that journey, and I'm really, really honored to be part of yours today. So thank you, everyone. Have a good Shabbos.